Welcome, everybody. My name is John Driver. I'm the Vice President Academic of Simon Fraser University. I want to start tonight by acknowledging that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and we are privileged to live and work on their traditional lands. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third of this year's President's Faculty Lectures. You may be wondering where the President is. He sends his regrets. He has gone to Ottawa to discuss university research and innovation. I think we could have brought Ottawa here to discuss university research and innovation, but apparently he's gone there to tell them how it all works. So thanks for joining us tonight. Obviously, we're at SFU's downtown Vancouver campus, one of our three campuses, and a campus that we're very proud to say the Vancouver Sun referred to recently as the intellectual heart of the city. And that's nice for us. We're celebrating our 50th year as a university, and we're also celebrating our vision to be Canada's most engaged university. And the President's Faculty Lecture Series is part of something called SFU Public Square, which is an initiative that we've developed to try and make that vision of being an engaged university a reality. The idea of Public Square and of these lectures is that you have an opportunity to both hear from, but also engage with leading faculty members at SFU, and to encourage discussion and enlightenment and promote dialogue on important issues of public interest. And in that spirit, we will have a question and answer session after tonight's lecture and an opportunity to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and talk to each other about what you've been hearing. I should let you know that we are filming the event tonight, and this will be available on SFU's YouTube channel. So if you have any qualms about being filmed, keep your head down and don't ask a question at the end. So let me turn now to tonight's speaker, Dr. Elicia Maine. Dr. Maine is an associate professor at SFU's Beedie School of Business, in one of the buildings of which is this Siegel Graduate Business Center downtown. She is also the director of a very interesting new graduate certificate program in science and technology commercialization that we've recently developed at SFU. Dr. Maine earned a PhD in technology management from the University of Cambridge, a master's degree. She wasn't content just to do technology. She did technology and policy in materials engineering from MIT. And at Queen's University, she had bachelor's degrees in both materials engineering and English, which is an interesting mix. Makes me feel good about doing archaeology. Before joining the university life, Dr. Maine worked in industry as a strategic consultant in Canada, the United States, and is it Austria or Australia? Austria. Wasn't sure if it was a typo. Specializing in the automotive sector and in various materials sectors. She currently provides innovation policy advice to Industry Canada and to Nano Canada, a national initiative that brings together industry, government, and researchers to enhance Canada's research and development capacity in nanotechnology. Dr. Maine's research interests are in technological information and science and technology entrepreneurship. She's most interested in understanding the formation and growth of science-based businesses. Along with her international group of collaborators, Dr. Maine is active in the Advanced Materials Commercialization Research Collaboration and the Global Nanobio Research Group. She's published her research in a number of high-profile journals, and some of the material that she's going to present tonight has just been accepted for publication in a journal, Nature Materials, which is a pretty high achievement. We think Dr. Maine exemplifies what it means to be an engaged researcher, and we're very fortunate to have her with us this evening to share her insights into turning invention into innovation, strategies for scientist entrepreneurs. Dr. Maine, thank you.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And thank you for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the audience tonight. I see students, current students, former students, colleagues, collaborators, friends. And we're here tonight to talk about turning invention into innovation, particularly here in Canada. And what we, those of us who consider ourselves scientist entrepreneurs, or those of us who are mentors to scientist entrepreneurs, can do to help Canada do a better job of turning invention into innovation. Now, I want to say what I mean by those terms, because they're sometimes used interchangeably, or dare I say it, inaccurately. And invention is the actual scientific discovery. So that's the aha moment, that's the research going on in the lab, and we're actually excellent at that in science, in science invention in Canada. We punch way above our weight. Where we fall down is on innovation, which is defined as a scientific discovery, or any discovery, that's brought to commercial application. So in the case of technology innovation, it's something that's come out of the research lab, it's been invented, it's been published usually, doesn't have to be, and then it's become either a product or service that's doing something in society or in the economy, or better yet, both, making societal value and economic value. And that's where we fall down. So I'm going to look at a report card for invention and innovation in Canada. And I have a funny relationship with report cards, because for as long as I can remember, I was rewarded for report cards. In fact, my father used to pay us all through primary school, through junior high, and through high school, according to our grades. So we didn't make an allowance. This is the way we made our money. And my three brothers and I, as long as I can remember, the promise was there that if you get 100% in any of your subjects, you get $10 per subject. If you get, that never happened for me, unfortunately, not in high school, but if you get an A+ in any of your subjects, you get $2 per subject, big drop off. You get an A, you get $1. You get a B, no money changes hands. Any C, this is where it's amusing in retrospect, any C that you earn, and it happened to Shane once, you pay my dad $1. Any D you earn, for every D you earn, which never happened, you pay my dad $2. And for any failed grade, theoretically, you would pay him 10. So big deal money, big incentive for us. And you could say that my dad invested a lot in report cards. And my father is actually a PhD chemist, and he was an MP in the Trudeau government, and I mean Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And later he was on the Science Board of Canada, right around the time that the Conference Board of Canada started issuing these report cards on Canada. And in the 80s, they started doing this, and it's been dismal reading, unfortunately, over those decades. And it's not, as I said before, it's not that we don't excel in science. We do. We're a nation of great inventors. Our science is world class, and we punch above our weight. And you'll see that in categories as I explain it. This is a report card of 16 comparable wealthy OECD nations. And you can see that we are above on that high metric. We're getting B grades, which means we're above average on some invention metrics, which I'll blow out for you here. I know you can't read them very well as they are right here. But what you can see is that there are some Bs in this report card, and those would be cost neutral. And there are a lot of Ds. To be exact, there are 13 Ds and 2 Cs. So essentially, Canada would owe my dad $28. And let's focus in on what those main metrics are that we do well in and that we fall down on when we're trying to turn invention into innovation. So in terms of scientific articles and a quality metric for scientific articles, we are better than that already high metric that we're comparing against, these wealth generating, high standard of living OECD countries. So in the number of scientific articles per normalized by population, and in the number of articles relative to our contribution that are in the top 1% of cited articles in the world, we punch above our weight. Where we fall down is when you get into these innovation and quasi-innovation metrics. So I call patents a quasi-innovation metric, or a halfway house, if you will, going from invention to innovation. Because they're an indication that you have confidence that this could have commercial value, right? And you're investing money, or somebody's investing money, saying that we think this could be brought into the marketplace to provide good in the economy, or good for society, or a combination thereof. And even in that metric, we get a D, both by population and normalized to the strength of our economy. There is a glimmer of hope on innovation metrics, though. In new firm density, we do create a lot of new firms compared to this high standard that we're comparing against. We get a B in new firm density. That's number of firms per 1,000 people created over the last 5 years. But what I want to point out to you tonight is that our venture capital, we know, is low compared to these comparable countries. And it's both in the total amount of venture capital and in the size per deal, about half that of our neighbors to the south. And that links right into here, this D metric that I'm going to focus in on tonight. Oops, sorry about that. That is, here we go, this D metric at the bottom, that is number of patenting firms that are less than 5 years old. So why do we care about firms who have filed for triadic patents? That means patents in the US, in Europe, and Japan that are less than 5 years old. Well, the reason we care about those is that they're a great indicator of the type of science-based firms that have an idea that is unique, that has world-scale significance, and that may be able to both address some big world problems and also help build the knowledge-based sector here in Canada. So you have to be a firm who's filing for patents in Canada, the US, Europe, and Japan for these triadic patents that they're measuring. You need to both have somebody who's believing in you to invest in you and the belief that you can create and capture value on a large scale. And that's an area where we really fall down. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that. So Industry Canada wanted to find out why, after decades, do we still keep getting this report card on innovation that's not getting better? Why do we still have a lot of Ds in the part where we're actually commercializing products? And it turns out they actually did an excellent survey. They commissioned an excellent survey in 2009. Hasn't been one done since. Of this sort of scale. But this is a survey where they asked the right questions. They asked them of the CEOs or innovation managers of firms across sectors in Canada that had more than 20 employees. And in the end, in their survey results, these are about 5,000 firms that replied. And they got the right people answering. And they said their major obstacle to innovation was the perception of risk and uncertainty. Think about that. Risk and uncertainty are my major obstacle to innovation. It's kind of ironic, because without risk or uncertainty, there's no real opportunity. So this is something that we have to be able to both change cultural attitudes towards, or train people to be able to, particularly people who could be leading these sort of ventures and leading new product development in these sort of companies that are important to our knowledge-based sector, but train people to better manage under environments of risk and uncertainty. So it's particularly problematic in this category that my research is about and that I'm going to talk mainly about tonight, which is science-based ventures. So you see this category up here, and again, I want to make another definitional distinction. We talk a lot about technology ventures and the technology sector. And the way I'm using the language here is I'm differentiating technology ventures from science-based ventures. And there's differentiation in the literature. A science-based venture is a venture that both commercializes science, but is also actively contributing back to the cutting edge of science. So they're publishing and they're patenting. And that's a science-based venture. And they have a lot of tacit knowledge. They're tightly tied to research institutions because the science is changing. And they face much longer times to commercialization. They face, it can be on the order of 10 years instead of, a few months to 2 years in a typical software venture, for example. And they face much higher levels of technology uncertainty. They face high market uncertainty too, but they certainly face much higher levels of technology uncertainty. And you can see here from this red circle, which is the amount of commercialization cost, the cost it takes to get it out of the lab and into commercially viable products is much, much higher. And so that's where the venture capital lack here, compared to our comparable countries, particularly constrains science-based ventures. Another look at them, this is one of the graphs, one of the figures slightly altered that we're publishing in the Nature Materials article that Professor Driver referred to, is trying to distinguish between advanced materials, a type of science-based venture, and biomed firms, to try to distinguish what's different for them, these types of science-based ventures, than IT ventures. And think about apps development, for example, which Vancouver does wonderfully well at all sorts of IT innovation. But think about apps development. You can develop an app maybe 3 months, 6 months. You can do it for a few $100,000. I've polled some of my students on costs there, as well as looked at more rigorous sources, but that's always a good one, a good live one. And I've looked at, so you're talking about a whole different scale. You may still have high market uncertainty, but you don't have the type of technology uncertainty that you face in science-based ventures. And you also don't have it for an extended period of time. We're talking 10 years of time here, up to 15 years. You don't have the same amount of initial R&D cost, and you certainly don't have these large scale-up commercialization costs. So here I'm thinking about clinical trials, and here I'm thinking about scaling up a new material, for example, into a production process, first into a pilot process, then into the full-scale kind of manufacturing facility that you need in order to make an economically viable product. And we'll talk about some examples there too. So it's really challenging. So you might just say, whoa, it's no wonder we don't bother with innovation in this space. We'll stick to invention in this space and we'll do our innovation up here. But the problem is, with that sort of a perspective, is that some of the great challenges of our country, of our world, come in this space. So, we're thinking about different methods of curing cancer. If we're thinking about, the impact of climate change and trying to reduce our carbon emissions. We're thinking about clean water. All of those sort of big issues, they're happening in this space. And so it's even more important, as well as the fact that you can build a very solid knowledge-based economy with good jobs in these spaces, it's also because these are some of our big complex problems, which are really worth fixing. And so it's not all doom and gloom. In fact, there's a lot of different approaches that we could take to impact this. And I could spend an evening talking about innovation policy and changes that we, both as a country and as a regional system innovation, could change to help this system. There's been some really good stuff about that in the Jenkins report, if people are familiar with it and wanted to read it. I could also talk about venture capital and different ways that we could work on that issue, and it's tied in with an innovation system, of course. But what I am going to talk about tonight is what scientist entrepreneurs can do in the environment that we're in to make their chances much better of getting important innovations here out of the lab and into the market space. And to do so, I'm going to run through this talk with an example of a scientist entrepreneur who inspires me. He's amazing. He inspires a lot of people. His name is Bob Langer at MIT, and he did not have it easy from the beginning. I'll tell you about that. But he has been able to spawn 30 ventures and positively affect the lives of tens of millions of people in a very complex space. And when I say he didn't always have it easy, when he started off in the chemical engineering, he graduated from chemical engineering at MIT in 1974, and he had a lot of job offers, but none of them were in areas that he thought he could make a real difference in. They were by oil companies, And he just didn't see that being the contribution that he wanted to make. And so instead, he took a very low-paying postdoc job with Dr. Judah Folkman at the Harvard Medical School. And he was the only engineer in a lab full of physicians and medical researchers. And he was, for a while, he was treated as little more than a technician. And yet he knew that there were real challenges, interdisciplinary challenges that he could face here. And so he ended up having a challenge that he was trying to work on as a chemical engineer, which was, to back up a second, one thing he really learned from Judah Folkman was to focus on clinical needs and on unmet clinical needs. And so this would permeate his work throughout his lifetime, and the examples we'll learn from him. But so he had this challenge in that there was a type of drugs that couldn't be delivered effectively to patients, macromolecular drugs. And he and Judah Folkman managed to solve the problem, drawing on their very diverse knowledge bases, drawing on chemical engineering, mixed with in the biomedical field. And they developed something called control-release polymers. And anybody who has a delayed drug delivery, a purposely timed drug delivery, is drawing on this technology that Bob Langer first published in Science and Nature in 1976, and then it became the basis for 10 ventures that spun out on the basis of this technology. And it's affected the lives of tens of millions of patients. But at the beginning, he couldn't do it. He couldn't actually get it out into the marketplace. In fact, he couldn't even get it patented. So what he tried to do, remember, this is very unique technology that's counterintuitive. It was a problem that no one had been able to solve. It drew on a very interdisciplinary base. And so he published it in Science and Nature, and they said he was really excited. These are huge publications. And all the experts in the field of chemical engineering wrote in and said, impossible, can't be done, must be something wrong with this data. So he's getting all these letters to the editor saying, this is wrong, foolish scientist. And then at the patent office, they're telling him, this isn't an invention, this isn't patentable, it's self-evident, right? And so he's getting these two from both sides. And he had the idea of getting the affidavits from all the experts who didn't believe his science and bringing it to the patent office and then being able to get his first patent issued. So it was a case where, he said it can't be both impossible and self-evident. And so he got his first broad-blocking patent, and it ended up creating all of this value. But he went on to have, beyond getting the patent and being turned down for a lot of grants at the beginning for this sort of innovative work, he also had a commercialization challenge in trying to get this, even after it's patented out into the marketplace. And the challenge was that he licensed it out, as you would think would be the case to do. There we go. He licensed it out, and large firms actually took the technology. They thought, okay, that sounds exciting. But then they sat on it, because this was radical innovation. And large firms are notoriously bad at radical innovation that does not fit within their current system. And so he realized that the only ways that he was going to get his inventions out into the world was to start his own ventures. And today, he's someone that we could all learn some strategies from, because he's had 30 ventures out of his lab. He has 100 students in his lab, which helps. He's had more than 1,400 papers. That's when we stopped counting in our study, 81 of which are in elite journals that are impact factor over 30. He's most cited engineer in history with 170,000 citations. He's had 360 US patents issued. These aren't filed for, these are issued, which have been licensed to more than 300 companies. And as I mentioned before, he's positively affected the lives of tens of millions of patients. And so my colleagues and I, after we had done a session with Bob Langer at AAAS, when it was in Boston, and were just blown away. We had come out in our sample, when we looked at the sample of all the firms in the world that had biotech and nanotech and had integrated the technologies. He'd come out already there as something that was off the norm. And when we talked to him and heard his story, we realized that there were a lot of lessons for scientist entrepreneurs and that many of them were replicable. So tonight I'm going to share 4 of those lessons with you that make a real difference to the way that Bob Langer has been able to get this cutting-edge science out of the lab and into the marketplace. And 2 of the strategies that I'm going to share with you are actually things that we've done research on for a long time. But he's an exemplar at doing it well, so I'm going to use him to describe them. The other 2, my research team and I discovered in our 2.5-year study of his lab, a detailed study. You know how I said there was 1,400 papers and 360 patents? Well, we matched those patents to the papers from which they came from and the ventures in which they spawned, and we looked at patterns and trends. And so we actually found out a lot about his strategies, some of which he didn't know before the study, and was quite grateful actually to find it out. So here are the 4 strategies that I'm going to talk about that I think that we can take and use here. The first is about technology market matching. The second is one that we found through looking at Bob Langer's research over time and analyzing it, and it's called the 3P technology strategy, which he's espoused himself, but which we've tracked and shown the data behind it. The third is strategic timing, and the 4th is founding team composition. So for technology market matching, this has been a theme throughout my research. Certainly advanced materials ventures need to be able to do technology market matching, and it's something that Langer also does very well, and so I'm going to show you both sides of it. So basically, it's a way of matching technologies with markets, but you're doing it when you're still in the lab, when things are still very highly uncertain, and you're prioritizing the markets that your technology can match, or the technologies that could be used to meet an unmet market need. You're prioritizing them based on looking at the whole industry ecosystem of the market. And suffice it for now to say that it's a key innovation management capability for a kind of science-based ventures that have radical, generic technologies. And so what do I mean by that? Well, a radical technology, the kind that the large firms don't do well with unless they fit their existing business practices, a radical technology is either a dramatic increase in what you already can do functionally, like a 50% increase, higher than that, more than that, or a dramatic decrease in cost, like a 50% reduction in cost, or enabling something new that never existed before, so an entirely new attribute. That's radical. And where radical signifies depth, significance and depth, generic technology or general purpose technology means you can use it again and again in different industries, in different applications. So when you have something that is really deep and really broad, there's a lot of value that can be created, and yet extremely difficult and challenging to commercialize. So an example here, a local example from SFU, is switch technologies. Who here is familiar with switch? Okay, number of hands, some more than others. Great. So switch is an example. Professor Neil Branda developed a new kind of polymer membrane that if you put a very small current across it, you could have it switch from being the way it is here, the way it is here as a clear polymer membrane to being opaque. So a very small current across it, you go from having a large, clear, transparent surface, a glass surface, to opaque one. Because you can put this membrane and sandwich it in glass. And they had this technology market matching problem. So it's in the lab, it's showing all this potential significance, and there's many, many markets that it can make a dramatic difference in and enable new performance functionality. And here are 3 of the top potential sources: automotive, glassware for activewear, and architectural, because you can put it all on the side of office buildings that are made of glass. And you can think, though, the automotive market, the active eyewear market, and looking at efficiency of buildings. Totally different value chains, totally different industry partners, different regulatory challenges and regimes, different custom development, different attributes valued. Small company, couldn't pick all of these at once. Now you do want to get your IP to cover all of these so that you have the right, but not the obligation to extract value from this later. But they had to pick one, and they ended up picking automotive and are very close to market with a sunroof with that technology now. So that's an example. And we think about this process as being analogous to a pair of scissors. So the key is that the technology opportunity and the market need can smoothly interact with each other to cut, to create value. And a key point is that you can either start from the technology and then find a market that actually matches tightly here, or start the other way and start with a big unmet market need and then go looking for a technology that's a good match for that. And Bob Langer is exceptionally good at this process. Now again, we've been studying this innovation capability since a co-author at Cambridge and I published on it in 2006, and we stumble across this exemplar of doing it in this space, who actually often starts from the unmet market need because of his early experience as a postdoc in Judah Folkman's lab. And so an example of that is a company he formed called Microchips. And what happened here was interesting. He knew that his controlled release drug delivery, which I've talked about before, that had been until that time used to deliver drugs through the bloodstream, right, through an infusion, or through an inhaler. So you could, they did work on being able to treat asthma and diabetes through an inhaler that you would then be able to breathe in and do it in a controlled release way. But the problem with both of those technologies and both those delivery mechanisms is they're really good at being able to deliver drugs that would circulate in the body for hours or days or even weeks or months. But that was about the limit. You couldn't engineer them to stick around any longer without the body's defense cleaning them up. And he had the idea here, he knew that for chronic diseases, it would be really nice to be able to have something implanted, something inert, that could release as the patient wanted it, as the patient could externally change their mind over the course of years, could reliably and accurately release drugs that they needed. So for a chronic disease, for something that you forget to take your drug at a regular time, for birth control was a big one that they had been thinking about and are now doing. And so Bob Langer was watching a documentary about microchip production, and he had that market need in mind, and he said, this could be a mechanism that we could use. So he started with the market need, he saw something, he didn't have the technology for it, he had the controlled release, but he didn't have any electrical engineering or any fabrication experience. So he went over and knocked on some doors in the electrical engineering department at MIT and found a prof who did. And so Michael Sema in electrical engineering, and he supervised an undergrad Europe student who went on to do his PhD with them. And John Santini was the first author of the paper in Nature that stemmed out of this research and the broad blocking patent that came from it. And it meant that they've gone on, they're in clinical trials now with these devices for birth control, and they're sponsored by the Gates Foundation, and also for, I believe, for some other chronic diseases. I'm not sure which ones, but they're pretty far along with this technology. And again, it came from a market need. So in summary of this first strategy, the technology market matching process, it's a key process. It's something that for science-based ventures, being able to do this when the technology is still in the lab and being able to do the type of forecasting and simulation and little tests that can help you see if there's a good match between a technology and a market is a key innovation management capability. And importantly to remember here is you're thinking about significant unmet needs and an innovation ecosystem that is receptive, i.e. there's not a big competitor there, and there's, the regulatory hurdles are possible, and that there's potential alliance partners or financing, for example. Okay, so that's the first strategy, the longest probably. The second one is directly, that was something, as I mentioned, we had researched already, and Langer just did it exceptionally well. The second one is something that we learned from our 2.5-year study on Bob Langer's lab. And I'd like to invite two of my collaborators who are in the room tonight who slogged through this study, and as well as all the sweat of it, as well as all of the intellectual debate and excitement. I have John Thomas, who's at the back of the room. Could you stand? And also Cynthia Shipka-Brett. Could you stand too, please? So Cynthia is our patent agent, and John is the technology management, innovation management lead on this. And I just wanted to both acknowledge their capabilities, embarrass them, and also allow you to ask them some questions afterwards, because it's a really interesting study. But anyway, so this 2.5-year study on his lab, and he had something called a 3P technology strategy, which is to do with the platform, papers he publishes around it, and the patents, the broad blocking patents that he did. And so let me talk first about the platform technology. So platform technology is like almost a generic technology. It enables many applications, but all within one sector. In this case, the biomedical sector, it's really broad. There's a lot of very distinct applications. So a platform technology is extremely broad for this sector. And his platform technology, which we discussed before, was controlled release drug delivery. But what he did with this platform technology, remember I said there was a lot of different applications, he enabled many different shots at getting this technology to market. And he did it in the form of several ventures, 10 in fact. So from this initial platform, and he's got more, but this is the most prominent platform, he has all these sub-platforms, but they're all building off controlled release polymers. And they're the different mechanisms that I talked about. There's microchips, which I mentioned. Here, there's a nanoparticle firm I'm going to talk about, Bind Therapeutics, and the one that you do from the inhaler, air, we'll talk about. And so this is the nanoparticle firm. So he had, remember, the controlled release, and his sub-platform here is saying, okay, this is controlled release, but let's add another layer to it. Here we're going to be able to deliver it in a very targeted and effective way. And here they're thinking about cancer treatment. And of course, the problem with cancer treatment, the chemotherapy can be extremely toxic. And if you could deliver it just to the cancer tumors and not to the surrounding tissue, how much better would that be for curing cancer and for the patient's experience? And so that's the idea behind this, and it's a nanoparticle that they developed, but it's carrying the therapeutic payload, the chemotherapy drug, in nanoparticle form. It then has the controlled release polymer matrix, which was the big breakthrough patent that he had started in the 70s when he made that invention. Above that, they have a stealth layer that allows this nanoparticle to get through the body without the defense mechanisms cleaning it up. And lastly, they have targeted ligands, which he'd co-developed with another prof at Harvard that he used to be in his lab, but that allow you to target just to the cancer site. So that's the platform technology. The paper and the patent around it are here. So you saw the platform technology, and the paper around it was published in Science in 1994. It's called Biodegradable Long-Circulating Polymeric Nanospheres. It was by two, Ruxanda Greff and Yoshihiro Minamitaki, postdocs in the Langer lab. And the patent around it is just those three. The paper has some more people on it. But what's interesting here is first that the patent was filed before the paper was submitted to Science. Of course, the paper issued before the patent did. But that was how important it is to get an early broad blocking patent in. And they're very similar, which helped us in our matching. The papers and the patents, they really build off of each other. There's a lot of similar text, so that helped us in our process. So his patenting strategy is to patent early and broadly. to use provisional patents, which I'll show in a minute, and to use CIPs, that's continuations in part, strategically. Who here has heard of a continuation in part? Okay, so some have. So I'll demonstrate that. But the idea there is to extend the time. So you want to patent early, and you want to patent broadly, because your patent's not worth anything if you can't keep other people out. But you want to also extend the life of how long that patent is active for. Because if you think of those commercialization timeframes, by the time you get through clinical trials, you want to have some time left when you can actually make money from that technology investment. And so broad blocking patents. And then the other strategy that he and the MIT TLO use, Technology Licensing Office use, is they try to make as much as they can out of the licensing by carving up field of use, geography, and by licensing out for a limited period of time when possible. Okay, so a conventional patenting strategy, what most of us would do, you patent something, it may not be particularly broad, you get something and then you continue and you find something else in your scientific research and you patent that. And it's a little bit different than what you expected before, and you patent as you invent something. What Langer and the MIT TLO do is they often first file a provisional patent very early on, and then from that will spawn a number of these yellow and red circles mean that they're broad and blocking. So they're broad, they're covering a lot of space, and they're effective to keep other people out of the space. And one other thing that they'll do with these three circles here is they'll patent multiple mechanisms at once. And they'll only continue the ones that end up being the most relevant and successful. But they'll do that, these patents are all filed at the same time. And here's an example that illustrates it in real life. This is with his company AIR, which is the inhaled controlled release drug delivery. And here they have a provisional patent that they filed in 1996. They abandoned it eventually, which is why it's dotted. But it spawned 4 different families, all off of that one patent. And they're continuations in part or a straight continuation. So a continuation means all of the claims are in there here. A continuation in part is part of the claims. So if it's all of the claims, then you have to add something new to have a new patent. The continuation in part, you can take part of those claims, and you can also divide a patent up into divisionals. So this is a strategy that they used, and then you can see as they file something new, here's that spot where 3 patents are filed in June 25th, 2001, all on different mechanisms, and they just continued the one that was the most successful. So what I'm trying to say here is he's using his patenting strategy to patent early, broad, blocking patents, and to extend the life long enough that venture capitalists are going to be interested in giving him the financing he needs to see this technology make it to the marketplace. Okay, so to recap, the 3P strategy is platform technologies, publishing elite papers, and filing early, broad blocking patents. But one of the interesting things that we found in doing this study was that the timing was not just in the patents. There was strategic timing used elsewhere in order to raise money in this very challenging environment. So there was strategic timing of founding the firm, something that we don't take advantage of enough here. There was strategic timing even of his elite publications, and which is, it's hard enough to get the elite publications, let alone time them, but I'll tell you about that. And strategic timing in alliance formation, all in the interests of being able to raise financing. And I'll give you an example here. This is with Bind Therapeutics, that nanoparticle company I looked at earlier. And the first control release paper happened to your far left. That was the initial control release work published in Science. Other key publications were the one that we talked about that was the first breakthrough in bind technologies in the nanoparticles, and later one that had to do with the targeting. But that wasn't enough. This first breakthrough patent and paper publication, he didn't form the company then. He decided it wasn't close enough to commercial viability. So unlike what is more typical for researchers to do, he scaled up the process, he kept it in his lab, didn't form a company, worked on some academic projects also that were all about scaling up the process, continued to patent, continued to move it closer to viability, and didn't found the company until 10 years after their first broad blocking patent. That's when they decided they were in the range of the window of financing that they were going to need to take them to market. So they were close enough to viability that they could raise financing quickly, which they did. It was exciting. You know, the venture capitalists could see the possibilities there. They could do clinical trials. Then they published strategically in Science Translational Medicine. It was great results, but they put the extra effort into that kind of a publication because it opened the door to alliance partners. So they ended up having partnerships with Amgen, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca because the scientists were excited about the results of their publication. And then that led them to being able to raise more financing through an IPO. So the point I want you to get with this particular timeline, and here it is the same timeline shown again, is that the patent was granted, again, a broad blocking patent, but they didn't found for 10 years. They published strategically in an elite journal to help them form alliances, and that helped them form an IPO. So this is a strategic use of the things that are within the control of a scientist entrepreneur in order to help them align their interests with the timelines of a venture capitalist and other financing opportunities. So the last strategy that I'm going to talk about today is founding team composition. And so this is something that a fair bit of research has been done on as well, but we found, it's a common question. So we've got this great scientific invention. Is it the faculty member who should found it? Is it the scientist who should found it? Should they be the CEO of the company? They certainly have the most passion for it. How much do you need of business experience? What's the right blend, especially when you're a science-based venture and you're counting very keenly on the tacit knowledge that's coming out of the research lab? Well, the formula that Langer used was although he founded 30 companies, played an active management role in none of them. So he sat on the scientific advisory board or as a director. Instead, on the science side, he had one of his alumni from his lab, whether someone who had just did their PhD or postdoc on the technology was usually the case, but it was an alumni from his lab who took over the role of CSO. And they were the people who, in Langer's words, would walk through walls to see this technology develop to the next layer. And he paired them with someone who had business experience, either a VC, someone who had multinational corporation experience, if that was relevant to the scale-up, or entrepreneurial experience. And they came in roles, the other management roles, president, chairman, CEO. And so the question is, how much does the scientist need to know about entrepreneurship? And if they're matching up with a business executive, do they really need to know? And the answer we've been seeing is yes, they still need to know something about it because they're leading the innovation in the lab. And so they need to know something about the market needs. They need to know something about the possibilities. They need to have a framework to assess opportunities from in order to do this critical technology market matching. And so we've seen some programs to try to help that in the US so far. The US National Science Foundation a few years ago started something called I-Corps, or Innovation Corps. And what they've done now is that the direct financer of R&D for small companies in the US, the SBIR, requires that any money that they give to someone who's funded by the NSF, those scientists have to go through I-Corps, which is a semester-long kind of boot camp in trying to use, in this case, lean startup principles. Who here has heard of the lean startup, or Eric Ries or Steve Blank? Okay, so it's becoming quite popularized, and it's very good. It's a big step forward to be able to use some of those concepts. The problem is that it's really good for marketing uncertainty. It's really good to try to think about that piece, but it doesn't deal well with technology uncertainty. And it's because Eric Ries, who developed the methodology, is a computer scientist. And he wasn't in the space where he had this degree of technology uncertainty. So what it could be augmented with, if you use Lean Startup, what you could augment it with is some more tools for managing technology uncertainty. Different valuation techniques, different experimentation techniques, thinking about scale-up issues, and ways to stage that uncertainty and yet lock in value. So Canada has not had a similar program until last September. And we aim to deal with technology uncertainty too. So we launched, here at Beedie, we launched a new cohort, a part-time, we're calling it a mini MBA for scientists. But it's a part-time program over the course of a year. And we have 18 students in it who are PhD scientists and engineers, postdocs, recent alumni, who are looking at complex, uncertain commercialization. They all have an innovation idea that they've been working on in their lab, that they're passionate about, that they want to see brought into the marketplace. And we had, just the other week, we had a competition here that was sponsored by Coast Capital and by SFU Venture Connection, where the two students who entered from this grad certificate won the competition, came first and second. And I see Isen here in the audience. Is Ben, are you here too? No, Ben's not here, but I'll talk about both of them. So I know Steve Holdcroft is here, who is part of this, a key part of this venture. So these two ventures, this one is Ionomer, is Ben Britton, who's a PhD student in chemistry and is in the Holdcroft lab. Steve, could you raise your hand? Yes. And they've invented a phenomenal new membrane that can change fuel cells and make them much more efficient and much less costly and more durable. So this is a really exciting lab-scale invention that could really change the market. And they're looking at the ways of commercializing this. And then Isen Dineshi here, who, could you raise your hand, Isen, at the back? He is a PhD student in engineering science, a biomedical specialty, who has a technique, his company is called Optolite, and they have a technique that's called something glass. What kind of glass? O-glass. O-glass, and it's a technique for ophthalmologists. It helps them to do more accurate testing and to be able to archive those tests. So instead of having the subjectivity that has characterized tests and patient diagnosis over time, it's something that's much more accurate and that you can compare against the last time that you did it. And so they've tested this, they've talked with 50 or more ophthalmologists, and they've won some awards about this technology. So here are two of the technologies that are being developed by people who are in this program who are very smart scientists and very passionate about what they're doing. And what we're trying to do is to create a cohort of people who understand more about managing under uncertainty, who understand more about how they can take their scientific invention and translate it into innovations that are good for our economy and that are good for societal needs. Big picture inventions. So, feel free to talk to Isen during the break. I'm gonna finish up there. If you really want some more, I have some papers here where some of this research was taken from, and you're welcome to ask for any of these if you would like them, and there's some copies of some papers around here. But I'm gonna quit there, and I would be more than happy to take any of your questions. And once again, thank you for coming tonight to listen to this research. Thank you. Great. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maine. All right, I'll take it. Yeah, is that working? That's going. Okay. Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I did think the field work in somebody's lab was just a really interesting idea. We do have an opportunity to ask Dr. Maine a few questions, or make a few comments, or offer her something to come and study, so she gets more insights into how innovation is translated into commercialization. We have roving mics that we can hand around, so if somebody would like to start with a comment, please feel free. There's one right at the back I can see already.
Great job, Elicia. It was really fun to listen to this. I'm curious, are you doing another study to study somebody similar to Bob Langer to see if they have a similar pathway?
So another 2.5-year study with 360 issued US patents matched to 1,400 papers, is that what you're asking? No. So that's a great question. And when we actually had this research first turned down at some really top-end journals, that they asked that question too. But what we were trying to make the case of is that he is an exemplar by many of these techniques. And so although we're not doing another study of that magnitude, what we are doing, and we actually are now having some love with that research, thank goodness. What we are doing instead is we're looking at some of the things that we've gleaned from that 2.5-year study, and we are taking on research here in BC and across Canada to look at what of those lessons make sense in our context and which things have to be dealt with differently. So it's trying to take some lessons from the Langer Lab and apply them here and say what else is different. I mean, we have some fabulous entrepreneurs too here working in, some of them here tonight, working in a different context. And some of it will be learning from them, and some of them will be applying from what we have already learned. If you have an idea of someone on, the 30 venture scale in this space, I'd like to talk afterwards about it, Peter. Thank you.
I know there was a question near the front here.
With Jeff.
Right there.
Yep.
Good evening. Thanks for your talk. That was quite interesting. I'm quite intrigued by one aspect of Dr. Langer's experience that I think is kind of indicative. He spent 30 years doing research before he actually started launching a venture to commercialize what he was doing. It's very hard for an entrepreneur like me to spend 30 years without being paid doing research before I can launch something. So my question is, in Canada, do we have the infrastructure to support scientists for that length of time before they move into commercialization? I went to that other university, the other end of the world here, and I always got the impression there that patenting something and aiming at commercialization was rather distasteful. It's not something that a real academic would do. The first thing you do is publish a paper, which means, of course, your invention is now not commercializable. Nobody will touch it. So I'm really pleased with what you're suggesting, that people follow this 3P strategy. My question is, are universities in Canada prepared to take that as a mandate and drive it forward?
That's a great question, Jeff. And I wanted to point out to other people in the audience that this is the 2012 Manning Innovator of the Year who just asked that question. So he's pretty darn good at it himself. But in Bob Langer's case, actually his first venture came out after about 10 years. John, 10 years? 30 years, the first venture? 13, sorry, okay, so 13 years before his first venture, after the bad experiences with the large firms sitting on it, right? Now, he did launch these ventures, the rest of the ventures, over a long period of time, still drawing on some of his original technology, that's true, but it was 13, not 30, of delay. Now, in terms of will our universities here resource scientist entrepreneurs in the way the MIT TLO will? Right now, no. And it's a much tougher environment, it's true. One of the things that I'd love to see changed about innovation policy in Canada, and also about the institutions, the major research institutions, how they look at patenting. And right now, most scientists can't apply for patenting costs on their grants. Even though they say they have a commercialization component of the grant, they can't apply for patenting costs, which is leaving the scientists between a rock and a hard spot. Because, for example, if your university has a limited budget that they don't have to recover, which is usually the case, in patenting costs, they're going to place their bets on things that they know incumbent firms are going to want to license, right? And so both the scientist, if they can't have their patent, any help with that patenting cost, they're not going to follow this advice and patent early and broadly. And we're not going to have those ventures get started because you need somebody who's going to bet in it early. And what the MIT TLO does, that it does very, very well, and we had a number of interviews on this research study with the second in command at the MIT TLO, Lauren Foster, who has had the Langer account for a couple of decades now. And she said that the MIT TLO will patent something, even if it is of no interest currently to large firms, but it'll patent it because they believe it has a societal value. So it's a very different policy than here. And that was even before Langer started making them a lot of money. So absolutely, I think patents, that D metric that we get, that intermediary to innovation, that's something we have to address here in Canada. And my answer would be that the granting agencies need to allow that to be qualified, that universities should start using it as a metric that is part of a path for promotion within the university. Right now it's not. And that there's a little bit more incentive for scientists to be entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Where should we go? One at the front here.
Yes, Dr. Maine. Dr. Maine, at the outset of your talk, you said that Canada is very good in invention, but not so great in innovation.
Correct.
Now, there is an institution called CERDIV, the Canada-Israel Innovation Research Development Foundation. And I'm sure some people may know that when it comes to innovation, Israel is probably one of the leading countries in the world. In fact, on the NASDAQ, they're number 3. United States, China, Israel. Why has Canada not taken advantage of doing joint ventures and innovations with Israel?
That's a great question. Can I put that one over to you, John? Okay. I know that there are some initiatives between Canada and Israel, but I've seen more local initiatives. I think a reason I wanted to throw it over to you is I think we have an SFU initiative with Technion, I believe.
Yeah, we have been spending some time in Israel and working on potential collaborations. I think they're more university to university, and I don't know the details of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. When we compare national systems of innovation, Israel is always an exemplar. Did you have?
No, it is university to university.
Okay.
Cybersecurity and a few other areas.
Okay, so far our initiatives, my understanding, are at a university level. It would be a great thing, country to do something more official with on a national level.
Just to give you an example of, I don't know how many in the audience heard, but there's now one of the greatest innovations called the bird, and it's being marketed in Japan and China. It will be in North America in mid-2016. The bird is the greatest innovation for interactive education, and I'd like to see Canada get into the action.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Maine.
Hi, Paul.
Great lecture. Thank you. You said the biggest obstacle was the attitude towards risk and uncertainty. So how did your study subject handle that, and can you teach that?
Fantastic question. I'd start by saying, as I'm sure you know, that there's a slightly different attitude towards risk and uncertainty that is more typical in the US, particularly in the Route 128 Boston area and in Silicon Valley, that there's a more tolerant or even welcoming attitude towards risk and uncertainty in those environments. In fact, I understand in Silicon Valley that it's a badge of failure to have failed in a few technology companies, and people will be more likely to invest in you if you had. So part of it is cultural. Part of it is seeing examples of people who have succeeded and have made innovation not a dirty thing for academics. Certainly, I believe it can be taught, and that's a big reason why we've launched this program. Other programs could be done like that. I think some of the key components are financial tools, thinking about resource allocation of budgets with the idea that there is some risk and uncertainty, and that you're hiding your head in the sand if you're only budgeting and making your decisions on things that are certain within a 5-year range. So for an example with healthcare, we have to look longer, even though it's a large cost. We have to look at longer time frames. We have to look at experimentation. And there's different financial tools that are very useful for doing that. Things like the use of real options, things like decision analysis, not just jacking up the discount rate in order to account for risk and uncertainty and make an investment look like it's not interesting. So can it be taught? Yes. Forecasting tools, scenario planning tools, technology roadmaps, certainly. And I think it's something that is worth paying more attention to in Canada by scientist entrepreneurs, by policymakers, and by government ministers and ADMs who are allocating budgets. Thank you.
My question sort of builds on the last two, which is, I'm still stuck on your first slide, which is why Canada is so bad at, on your father's scale. I mean, a B wouldn't even have netted you $1.
It's true. It's true.
There weren't any A's at all on there. So maybe you can elaborate a little more, at least in terms of public policy is the area I come out of. What policies we could adopt that at least comparable countries have adopted. Being at 13th out of 16 in the OECD is really quite shameful. And as much as I can tell, we've been in that rank for a very long time.
Yes.
Are there any countries that you know of that have actually significantly changed their rank on that ranking, or are you locked in? And then more specifically, can you think of any particular initiatives, the ones that have worked in Canada that we could easily import? Because we're not going to turn ourselves to Silicon Valley tomorrow, but maybe there are some things we could do where we could at least move from 13th to, 11th or 10th.
Yes.
And lastly, I'll just quickly say,
Yep.
I mean, a comment that something is cultural in my world is akin to saying there's a lack of political will. It's a proxy for we don't know what the answer is and we haven't figured it out yet.
Thank you very much. Those are excellent questions. One thing that I do I teach classes to MBAs, Management and Technology MBA and the Executive MBA. In fact, I'm starting a new course this Friday, and in Managing Technology Innovation. And for the EMBA, just Managing Innovation. But I sneak a bunch of technology in there. And so one of the very first things that we do is we look at the context in which innovation happens. And different teams will take a different country and look at the most up-to-date research and publications on the national system of innovation of the country that they've chosen. And so I get, twice a year, I get updates on all of the national systems of innovation, which is wonderful. And so yes, there's definitely countries that have changed their national system of innovation over time. So the national system of innovation is all the policies at the national level that are impacting on your innovation report cards. And they're things like the kind of investments that you make in research institutions, in government research labs. They're things like what focus you had on some certain sectors so that your dollars can go farther. They're also things about how you translate, what kind of mechanisms you have in that country that help translate ideas from the university, maybe to a more applied government research lab and out into industry. And I'm thinking of the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany as an example there. So pieces like that and where their focus is. And some countries that have really been able to change over time, South Korea, wow, huge change and a very purposeful policy-driven change. Switzerland's always an exemplar. The Scandinavian countries do really well. And there are certainly policies we could learn from them, but I would say that the number one change that I would make in our national system of innovation and the way that we stimulate innovation and support innovation here in Canada is I would follow the Jenkins report that said, trim some of SHRED, make SHRED a little bit more easy to administer, have less consultants using it, having to help with it and taking 30% of SHRED dollars, and take that money that you trim. Don't cut it by any means, but we are the most generous funder of indirect support of R&D of any of our comparable countries, right? We're the most generous, but it's coming through the CRA, right? And it's coming only once you're profitable to a large degree, right? So you have to be thinking you're going to have profits soon enough that you can benefit from that. So I would take that money and I would shift it over to direct support of R&D. And the analogous programs in the US are the SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, and the STTR. But they have other forms through DARPA, where they direct support R&D, through now ARPA-E, through the environmental and clean tech innovations. And you think about the US as a total free market economy, but actually on science ventures, they have a very active role. And one of the firms in town that invests in advanced materials innovations around the world, Pangea Ventures, in their portfolio, they'll always have 8 out of 10 ventures will be in the US, and every one of those ventures will have had direct, non-dilutive financing from grants such as these from the government. And we don't have that same benefit here in Canada to help us get through the valley of death. So that's the number one thing I would change. It doesn't even have to be net dollars. Unfortunately, so far, they followed the part about SR&ED being trimmed, but not the part about reallocating the financing. So that's the number one thing I would do. If we had a more direct mechanism for supporting this kind of science-based venture. And the second thing I would do is changing the way that patents can be paid for out of granting agencies.
I think we have time for one more question, and I see a hand go up here, and then I will wrap it up and encourage a more sociable discussion at the other end of the room around coffee.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I want to make a comment saying that Robert Langer is a good example, but there aren't that many Robert Langers out there. So as a grad student myself, how can we be a process in this, in innovation? And how does the graduate students in Langer's lab play a role in innovation?
Sure, great questions. So, Langer has a lab of about 100 grad students and postdocs, and a lot of them end up starting ventures. So they'll either be in a venture from a technology in his lab, or they'll go on to be innovation leaders in whatever company that they join because of some of the skill sets that they gained in this lab, and particularly looking at unmet market needs. So one big piece of advice is they get filtered all the way through when they're in that lab. Bob Langer, who himself was filtered by Judah Folkman, will say to them, if that's your idea, that could be good. And then they'll come back to him with another idea that has a big unmet market need, and he says, yeah, that'll be huge, right? And they're channeled towards ideas that may be risky, but if they succeed, they could make an enormous difference, right? And that's sort of the thinking there. It's very bold thinking, and it's much more led by market needs than is typical in a science lab. Now, I would say there are some great entrepreneurs here in town that you could learn from. And one of them asked a question earlier tonight. Another one is sitting very close to you over here, Steve Holdcroft behind you. There's others here in the crowd. Peter Cullis at UBC, who's the head of the Life Sciences Institute. He's a great scientist entrepreneur to learn from, has had 7 startups. So there are people here too. I would also say that educate yourself a bit more about ways to deal with risk and uncertainty. You're welcome in our grad certificate. So.
Good recruiting there.
Thank you.
I'll just wrap this up with a couple of comments. I'd like to go back to the question about the connection to Israel and just reflect upon the fact that when we have been to Israel in the last few years, we've gone in conjunction with the city of Surrey. And the city of Surrey is very interested in what Israel has done, particularly in high-tech industries. And you may know that SFU has partnered with the city of Surrey to create something they're calling Innovation Boulevard, which is an area in Surrey that is focusing on high technology, and particularly as it relates to health research, taking advantage of Fraser Health, Surrey Memorial Hospital, and in fact the city of Surrey's interest in developing innovative industries within that space. So it's an interesting partnership there, not so much between the university and the federal government, but the university and a municipal government. And I think there's some real interesting opportunities there as well. Now, the reason I introduced Surrey was to remind everybody that our next President's Lecture is in Surrey. And appropriately, it will be on a health theme. And our speaker is a very distinguished professor, Dr. Kelly Lee from the Faculty of Health Sciences. And she will be speaking on institutional innovation and global health. And that will be on April the 6th out at the Surrey campus. It's only a SkyTrain ride away, so you can get there from Vancouver. So let me just remind everybody, we do have some light refreshments at the other end of the room, and perhaps I could just wrap up by thanking Dr. Maine once again for a stimulating discussion. Obviously got a lot of interest from the audience tonight. Thank you very much for presenting your research.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Really
Appreciate it. Thank you.